Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Blastyface, and first of all, I just want to give a special shout out to Icy Veins. That's where I did all my research, and I'm going to leave a link to that research that I did in the description. So if you want to read into any of the things that I'm talking about, you can check down there. Today, we're going to be looking at how you can choose your main for Shadowlands. So this is honestly one of my favorite parts of every new expansion because it's all new. You get to choose a new class, and this is when I just start getting really excited about the new expansion. So I think we should do that together, and let's talk about how you can choose a main for Shadowlands. And here are some things that you should probably consider while you're watching this video. This is all before pre-patch. So you want to definitely test your top picks in pre-patch to see what the changes are and to see if you really, really like them. Don't choose your main solely based on the numbers. You want to look at how fun the class is for you, first of all. That is honestly the most important thing because you're going to be putting hundreds of hours into this class. And if it's something that you just don't like and Blizzard balanced it and you're still playing that class, you're just going to burn yourself out. You're not going to have fun. So that's the most important thing, is just to pick first and foremost what you really, really enjoy playing. And then also look at what it brings to the content that you want to do. So instead of just looking at the numbers, does it bring utility to the Mythic Plus content or the rating content that you want to do? That's also an important thing to choose or to look at when you try to choose your class. Don't choose a class based on which covenant is strongest right now for that class. Pick based on which class has you most engaged and excited without covenants or legendaries. So in other words, you wouldn't order a banana split for the cherry on top when you hate bananas. So that core foundation of the class is what you're choosing, not the covenant abilities or the legendaries that bring the class together. Because again, if those things get switched around at some point, you're going to be stuck with a class that you ultimately don't like. Consider your primary objective first. So what are you going to do? What's the most important thing for you to do this expansion? Is that high-end Mythic Plus, or is that Mythic rating, or some sort of variation of that? Just make sure you have an objective first. So for instance, my objective is Mythic rating. So I'm going to pick my class based on that, not based on, oh, I also want to do Mythic Plus. Pick it based on the most important thing to you. And this is going to be a PvE guide. That's what I do. I do the Mythic rating, and I can't speak to PvP, unfortunately. So I'm not the guy you want to come to for PvP. Your ultimate goal is just to narrow down the pool. So you're taking this big pool of characters and you narrow it down. You cut characters out of the list. So don't just try to think about picking one. Think about kicking certain classes out of your pool, and you want to narrow that pool down as much as possible. So another way to narrow that down is to think about what your main role is going to be. Are you going to tank? Are you going to heal? Are you going to DPS? If you are a tank or healer, that's easy because that automatically narrows down your pool. There's only certain classes that can do that. If you're a DPS spec and you're trying to narrow down that list, think about whether or not you like melee or ranged. That's a good way to start narrowing it down. I prefer melee personally. Some people prefer ranged. Some people don't really care either way. But that's one question you can ask yourself. And the other is, it is a multi-spec DPS. So some people prefer having only one DPS spec. That means you only have to gear up one spec. You're depending on Blizzard to balance that spec properly. So for instance, if you're playing a Demon Hunter and Havoc is not doing well, that's kind of, you're kind of out of luck in that situation. But at the same time, you only have to gear up one spec. And on the flip end of that, if you're playing a mage, then you have to gear up potentially a number of different specs depending on the fight and the situation in the raid, or if you're doing Mythic Plus, it might be better to gear up a different spec for a Mythic Plus. So you have to keep those things in mind too when you're making your decision. And then another question is, are you willing to play all the specs? A lot of people, myself included, like to play whatever's strong. Sometimes things do not get balanced in the way that you would like them to, and your favorite spec is not doing very well. A good question to ask is, are you willing to play all the DPS specs or all the specs? So we can look at something like Warlock. Are you willing to play Affliction, Demonology, and Destruction? And that's something that you have to play around with. Do that on the pre-patch. Play around on the pre-patch and see if you actually like playing all those specs. You might find that you are okay. You might prefer a certain spec, but you're okay playing all three of them. And that's kind of what you want to do, because a lot of people, whether or not you admit that you do this, a lot of people just like to play what's best. And that's totally okay. That is totally okay. And then we have to talk about combination classes as well. So classes like Death Knight and Druid that you can play tanks and DPS, or you can play all three. You can play tank, heal, and DPS. Just again, remember what your main objective is. That's the most important thing. Are you going to raid as a DPS, but you like to heal or you like to tank sometimes in Mythic Plus? Don't worry about what you might do in Mythic Plus occasionally. The most important thing is you're picking a class that fits your main objective. That's the most important thing. And remember, alt leveling is supposed to be easier in Shadowlands. We'll see if that's true. But if you like tanking in Mythic Plus occasionally, you can bring up a different class to suit that need. So make sure you're picking a class to suit your primary objective. That's the most important part. So we'll just go through each of the classes really quick. I know there's a ton to cover, but I'm just going to give you a general overview of all the classes and specs and tell you what's kind of looking good or what's maybe not looking so good for Shadowlands. And you can start thinking about maybe what you would like to play for Shadowlands. So first, let's talk about Death Knight. Death Knight was my main in Legion, and it has a special place in my heart, and it is looking really, really good for Shadowlands. The reason for that is because, first of all, let's talk about Frost and Unholy. We can kind of pile them into the same group because they somewhat do the same thing. They're both strong at AoE. They have okay single target. They do have low mobility. Unholy is a pet spec, so you have to keep that in mind. But what does it bring that's so good other than those things? Well, it has Death Grip. Death Grip in the past few expansions or past few raids has been pretty much required. So it is essentially you pull an enemy into you. So that's really, really, really useful, especially for certain fights. And then in Shadowlands, we're getting Anti-Magic Zone. So Anti-Magic Zone basically is a little bubble that you put down. It'll reduce magic damage by 60%, which is absolutely insane. It is making Death Knight a requirement. It's definitely going to be something that is needed and necessary in Shadowlands. So if you are a Death Knight player, you're looking pretty good and you should feel very good about that choice. As far as Blood is concerned, it's the king of self-healing now that Demon Hunter's kind of getting knocked off that pedestal. It has answers for everything. It again has Anti-Magic Zone, and it has utility with not only Death Grip, but it has Gorfine's Grasp, which is similar to Death Grip, but it pulls all the enemies into an area. So it has really, really good utility. Again, it doesn't have very good mobility, but that doesn't bother too many people. You just have to try it on the pre-patch and see how you feel about it. So all in all, Death Knight looking really, really good for Shadowlands. Let's hop over to Demon Hunter. The kind of running joke in the community is that Demon Hunters are the easiest to play. And I would agree with that, but that's not a bad thing. Don't let anyone tell you that that is a bad thing, because different players have different preferences and you don't have to worry about it. Especially if you're a newer player, I'd highly recommend playing Demon Hunter because it is going to be strong and you don't have to worry too much about a rotation on Demon Hunter. There is a rotation, obviously, but it's not super complicated. The good thing about Demon Hunters also is that they bring a magic debuff. So when you hit an enemy, it gets a magic debuff. Essentially, whoever does magic in your raid team is going to do that much more damage to the enemy. You have to have at least one of these in your raid team. It's also one of the highest mobility classes in the game, which is awesome. It feels really, really fun to play. It's the newest class in the game as well. So it kind of has that action-oriented play style. It's very flashy. It's very fun, but you only need one generally. So if you already have a Havoc Demon Hunter or a Vengeance Demon Hunter in the raid, the necessity for another one is very, very slim in a raid setting. So you have to keep that in mind. It's also a highly played class. So there are going to be a lot of people vying for that spot, and you might lose your spot if your only choice is a Demon Hunter. So you have to keep that in mind. Let's also talk about Vengeance. So Vengeance is high mobility. Its self-healing recently got nerfed, so it doesn't do as well if you're comparing it to something like a Blood Death Knight. There's only one consideration for a raid spot for a Demon Hunter, like I said, because they don't really bring that much to a raid, not as much as other classes could potentially bring, but you're looking for that Demon Hunter for that magic debuff. Other tanks can do the same thing a little bit better. They've kind of had a hard time finding a place. They've never been best in raid, and only occasionally are they really, really useful in Mythic Plus. So you kind of have to look at that and consider what you want to do. They're kind of okay at everything, but they're not great at anything. And especially the higher tier of content that you're doing, you're not looking for okay, you need to have great. Druid. People tend to love Druid for that class fantasy, and you can't blame them. Let's talk about all the different specs. So they have 2 DPS specs, and they have 1 healing spec, 1 tanking spec. Let's talk about balance first. The playstyle isn't really for everybody. You have to look into Balance Druid and see if it's for you or not. Play around with it on pre-patch and see if the playstyle is for you. It has great multi-dot and AoE capability, but it needs some buffs to kind of bring it in line with the other classes that do something similar. Let's talk about Feral. Feral, you either, again, love or hate them. Try it on the pre-patch, see what you think. It's pretty straightforward dot class. So if you're not used to dot classes, or you want to try a melee class, but you want to do a dot class, you might look at them. They are straightforward. They're easy to play. Not a lot of spinning plates or anything like that. They're not currently as useful as other melee DPS in Shadowlands. So you need to consider that as well. Is it better to bring a Druid, or is it going to be better to bring something else? Currently, Feral needs a major buff to be useful in Shadowlands. So we don't want to solely look at DPS numbers right now, because those can all be changed. But historically, Feral has kind of found it hard to find a place among raid teams, and even in Mythic Plus, it can be a little hard to get that raid spot if you are a Feral Druid, or if that's what you want to play. Let's talk about Resto. Resto is usually a safer pick. It has heavy AoE healing. It has great group-wide CDs, and it has low damage compared to other healers. So that might not bother you. It usually finds a pretty good place in a raid, at least one of them, because of all of the things I mentioned before. But that low damage can hurt it compared to other healers. Guardian Druid is lacking in damage mitigation options compared to other tanks. It does have high damage reduction, but it's on a long CD and it has a short uptime. The cool part, I think, about Guardian Druid is you can have 100% uptime on Iron Fur with overlapping stacks. So you can use multiple stacks of those to get higher physical damage reduction, which I actually really, really enjoy about the spec. It has group-wide movement for the raid, which is a good utility to have. And the other thing that I think you should think about it is it's fairly easy for new players to play the Guardian Druid. You're essentially pressing your abilities on cooldown. You have a filler and you spend your resource on Iron Fur, or you can spend your resource on extra damage depending on whether or not you're actively tanking. And then of course you have your major cooldowns, which you can use when you need them in the fight. So it's kind of a good go-to if you're interested in tanking and you don't want to overwhelm yourself or anything like that. Guardian Druid is a good place to go. In terms of strength for raiding in Shadowlands, it needs a bit of a buff in order to be on par with the other tanks. Is it a bad choice? I don't think it's a bad choice. It's certainly higher up on the list. Hunter. So Hunter is a very safe pick because it has 3 DPS specs, which means that if one of the specs starts falling behind, you'll generally have another spec to fall back on and use that instead. So generally 3 DPS spec classes are safe picks for raiding and also for Mythic Plus because you have a lot of options there. You have more things that you need to keep up in terms of gear. So keep that in mind also. Let's talk about Beast Mastery first. It's the highest mobility caster, so you can continually move around even when you're casting your abilities, which is super, super useful. It doesn't fill a melee slot. It is that range spot, and you also get to be highly mobile. So you're essentially taking a lot less damage as a caster if you're playing it right. It's very straightforward to play. Essentially, your job is to buff your pet and don't let that buff drop. That's where you're going to do the most damage. It's really, really good single target damage. It does good AoE damage, but it's lacking on 2 targets, or if those targets are too spread apart, it's lacking on that damage as well. Pets bring utility with Primal Rage, so if you need another Bloodlust for some reason, you can bring that with one of your pets. Pets can be kind of annoying, but it depends on the person. For me, I don't think they're that annoying. They can be annoying for some players, so you kind of have to just decide that for yourself, whether or not a pet is a deal breaker for you. They are a little bit behind Marksman currently in tuning, so again, keep that in mind. And then it brings Aspect of the Turtle, like all of the other specs, so you can essentially immune some of the abilities in raid, which makes it a really good go-to class for those little jobs that you need to go run out and do something helpful for your raid team. Some people love that, and we love you as the rest of the raid team for going out and doing that. Let's talk about Marksmanship. So Marksmanship, one of the fan favorites, has really good AoE and single target and 2 target cleave. It is lacking in spread AoE, and it is a locked caster. So that just means whenever you're casting a certain ability, you have to stand absolutely still or it's going to break that cast and you're going to lose the damage. So another thing to think about. It also is looking to be the strongest spec for Hunter in the upcoming raid, Castle Nathria, so keep that in mind too. That might affect your decision a little bit, but again, pretty straightforward to play and really fun to play. What about survival? So unfortunately, survival's in a really, really bad state right now in the beta. It has historically good single target damage, and it has really good leech when you have ferocity pets. It's kind of had a hard time finding a place in the past few expansions. It's never been the de facto, you have to have a survival hunter in this raid. There's usually other melee classes that do a better job than it will do. So it would have to be doing really, really well in terms of balancing in order to be the go-to spec to play. And I have yet to see that happen with Survival Hunter. It's kind of had a hard time in the past few expansions, but you never know, it might change. So Mage, another fan favorite. Who doesn't love the Mage? The Mage is another 3 DPS spec, so it's usually a safer pick. There's always going to be one of those specs that's doing really well. And unfortunately, that also means one of those specs is usually not doing too well. But you can think of that as it makes your decision a little bit easier. Let's start with Arcane. Arcane has great burst and multi-target burst. It has a hard time finding a place in the last few expansions. Again, like I talked about with the Hunter, It hasn't done historically well, but that doesn't mean it won't do well in Shadowlands. It just means it's kind of had a hard time finding a place in the last few expansions. It was recently nerfed on the beta, meaning Blizzard wants to keep it in check. It is looking at Arcane Mage. It was doing exceptionally well, and now it's only just doing pretty damn well. So keep that in mind. Frost is very strong single target. It's currently the best cleave in the game, and it's looking very, very strong in Shadowlands. You can't really go wrong with Frost. It's looking super good. It's very, very useful for a lot of the fights in Castle Nathria. Fire's kind of been in a weird place. Ignite no longer spreads and requires more effort to spread. So you have to use an ability in order to spread those ignites, whereas before they would just do it on their own. The usefulness of Ignite in the new raid is negligible anyway. Fire looks to be less useful than Frost in the new raid. So you gotta also keep that in mind when you're looking at your picks. Let's talk about Monk. Windwalker is one of the most fun classes to play according to the community, and I would tend to agree. I do find Windwalker to be very, very fun. It has seen a lot of instances where it falls behind in a lot of the expansions. It seems that Blizzard kind of have a hard time buffing it and keeping it relevant for the past few expansions. And unfortunately, right now, it looks like they're not getting a lot of love. The viability of the class is heavily dependent on whether or not Blizzard wants to buff them and keep them viable throughout the expansion or for that raid tier. So keep that in mind. They don't get a lot of love, but they are super, super fun to play. And also keep in mind your objective. So if your objective is kind of casual stuff and maybe Torghast, this might be a pretty damn good pick for you. It would probably be very, very fun in Torghast. Let's talk about Mistweaver. Good healing burst with the right setup. It lacks a good toolkit for the raid, and it's dependent on buffs from Blizzard right now to be viable. So that's kind of a tough place to be for the Mistweaver Monk right now, being just dependent on a buff from Blizzard. It could be viable, but they need to buff it, and we cannot guarantee that. So let's talk about Brewmaster. Brewmaster has a very, very fun play style. I completely agree with that. They are very, very fun to play. It has competitive magic mitigation, and it has the best physical mitigation. It has smooth, predictable damage intake, which is kind of the niche of the monk, the Brewmaster monk, which is awesome. They're always very, very useful. They have good mobility. They have good utility. They bring the physical damage debuff to the enemies. So like I talked about on the Demon Hunters, it's similar, but it is a physical damage debuff instead of a magic damage debuff, which is very necessary to have. So you're going to at least need one of these in there. And it's a general strong and safe pick for raid tanking. Paladin. So Paladins are another fan favorite. Really, really awesome class fantasy. Really good transmog for this class. Let's talk about Retribution. So they have traditionally awesome burst, and that is no different for Shadowlands. A very straightforward play style. They're super fun to play, pretty easy to play. It has the best group utility in the game for all three specs. The utility on this class is what sets them apart from other classes. They don't historically do the best DPS, but they do make up for it with that utility. Let's dive right into Holy. Holy is a safe pick as a raid healer. It has super strong damage, really, really good utility, and it has the strongest raid cooldown in the game with Devotion Aura, so there's always going to be a place for a Holy Paladin in the raid team, so keep that in mind if you're a Paladin. A really, really good spot to be. Protection Paladin is also in a pretty safe spot right now. It has the best utility in the game. Again, awesome class fantasy. You got that big shield. It's a safe and strong pick right now, regardless of its main drawback, which is you do have some openings where you don't have mitigation up and you can be vulnerable for that high damage intake. So really, really keep that in mind as well. But still, they're a very viable pick and they're very high on the list for viability in Shadowlands. Let's talk about the priest, starting with Shadow. Shadow has lots of positive changes that went through in Shadowlands, and people seem to be very, very happy about them. They're super, super fun to play. They're a great multi-dot class. They have better single target and AoE with the changes. They are one spec reliant, so again, you don't have multiple DPS specs to fall back on. And I hate to say it, but if you don't like being asked to heal, don't play it. There might be situations where there's just something better than a Shadow Priest, and you might be more useful as a healer. So it's kind of a scary pick to pick a main Shadow Priest, but if you're concerned about it, talk that over with your guild leadership or whoever you need to talk to see if that is a good pick for you. Let's hop down into the healing specs. Discipline. Wow, Discipline is in a really good spot right now. It's the best DPS healing spec in the game. So you're going to be doing really, really acceptable DPS. And you also do not necessarily healing, but what you do instead of simply healing is you are negating the damage before it comes in, which is probably the best type of healing, and I do that in quotes, there is in the game. So you protect people with shields and you negate damage in that way instead of healing it up after it happens. It's one of the strongest healers when played properly, but it's one of the most punishing healers when played incorrectly. So you need to get a lot of practice. You need to get a lot of knowledge in. If you're one of those people that likes going into the fights and you learn a lot in the fights, you learn when that damage is coming in, you probably are going to do great with Discipline. It's looking extremely strong in Shadowlands. Holy is a strong all-around healer. It has strong cooldowns. Unfortunately, it's just overshadowed by Discipline, but Holy is much easier to play if that affects your decision at all. There are stronger options for top tier content, but that doesn't mean that Holy Priest is bad. It just means it's being overshadowed by Discipline right now because Discipline is so damn good. Rogue was my main for BFA, and I absolutely love rogues. So let's talk about Rogue. First of all, let's talk about Assassination. So Assassination has kind of historically been the de facto safe raid pick for a few expansions. That may have changed. We'll talk about that in a second. It's weaker than sub in single target situations right now, which is historically what it was strong at. It is good at the multi-dot. So if you have multiple targets that live long enough for those dots, you can multi-dot. The biggest drawback there, especially compared to some of the dot classes like Affliction Warlock, is that you require movement in order to multi-dot things. So keep that in mind. But it looks like it's in a fairly stable place, especially if Subtlety gets nerfed. So let's jump into Subtlety and talk about that. Subtlety is the strongest single target in the game currently, so it's in a very, very good place, but maybe in a very scary place if Blizzard decides to give it that nerf bat. It's great sustained cleave, but that's dependent on having the proper covenant choice, so keep that in mind. Historically, it's fell behind in the last few expansions. It's kind of had a weird place. It had these niche fights, and then it got nerfed, and now it's kind of been at the bottom ever since. So it all is contingent again on whether or not Blizzard wants to see this spec shine again. So we'll see if it shines, and it's looking right now to be the strongest rogue spec currently in rating. Outlaw has great cleave like it has in the past due to Blade Flurry, but the single target and the priority damage is really, really, really lacking. So it's not going to find a place in Castle Nathria, at least not in the state that it's in right now. But that doesn't mean it's not going to be the strongest spec for Mythic Plus. We will have to see when Mythic Plus starts to develop. And it has a better playstyle now with the changes to Roll the Bones than it used to, and those buffs have changed as well. So it feels better to play, and that's one of the positives of Outlaw Rogue. Let's hop on down to Shaman. Shaman, again, 3 specs. It has 2 DPS specs and 1 healing spec. Let's start with Elemental. Elemental, sadly, is desperately in need of some love from Blizzard. It's currently not excelling on anything. You can pretty much bring a different caster, and it's going to be doing a better job. So it needs to see some love from Blizzard currently to do well. I know we said we weren't going to make those decisions based solely off of numbers, but there are some situations like this where Blizzard just needs to give it some love to make it a viable choice. But enhancements had some of the most positive feedback from the community so far. Has a really solid kit, has decent AoE and single target, and it's not looking to be the best, but it's certainly not by any means weak. So another thing to think about, that does take a melee spot in enhancement. So another thing, are there other melee specs that you would rather play or rather bring than enhancement? And let's talk about restoration. So restoration, it's the most complete healer kit in the game. So it can do anything or everything well. One of the best healer CDs in the game with Spirit Link Totem. And Resto Shamans have suffered from spread healing, but that's less of an issue in Castle Nathria. Definitely a very, very viable spec to play in Shadowlands, and very, very safe if you are looking for a spot right now as a healer. Might want to look at the Shaman. Let's talk about Warlock. If you are planning to play Warlock in Shadowlands, you're a very, very happy boy or girl right now. It seems like Warlock for the past few expansions, and certainly in Shadowlands, it's the more the better. The more of them you have, the better. To a certain extent, of course. It has great utility. It has the gates. You have health stones, great single target damage, great cleave damage with affliction. Doesn't suffer as much as other casters from movement, and it's very, very strong in Castle Nathria. So that's all from the affliction standpoint. If you are playing affliction, you are looking pretty damn good right now. So be praying that they don't hit that with the nerf bat. What about destruction? So if they do hit it with the nerf bat, you still have destruction. Destruction's doing great as well. Some of the best sustained AoE in Shadowlands, great raid utility for the same reasons. Multiple warlocks, again, are always good. And they're strong enough outside of that AoE to still be very, very useful. So they're looking to be in a very, very safe place right now. And again, it's one of those 3-spec DPS classes. So no matter what, you're probably always going to have a safe spot in your raid team, especially as a warlock. What about demonology? Unfortunately, it's doing a little bit worse than the other two, but sometimes that's okay because you do have the other two as a choice. It's very durable. It's probably the most durable caster in the game, but that doesn't make up for the damage that it's lacking. Unfortunately, that is too bad, but they do need a buff in order to be useful currently. But you do have those two other specs to choose from, so don't feel too bad about it. And Affliction's looking to be maybe the best spec in Castle Nathria, so also keep that in mind. Warrior. So Warrior's 2 DPS specs, 1 tanking spec, and historically in the past, Warrior has found a very safe place. Generally, at least one of the DPS specs will be doing very, very well. Arms right now is currently lacking. The only niche that it fills, which is a very, very small and not very useful niche, is 2-target cleave. So that's kind of the only thing they excel at, and that's not very useful in Castle Nathria. So they need some buffs in different areas in order to become useful because they are lacking in single target and AoE. So they do need some buffs to be viable right now, but you never know. In some of the future raids, they might be the best because we've seen that a few times. Fury, if you're a lover of Fury, you're in a very safe and good place right now. They have a great execute. Their priority damage can cleave, so you can knock down that priority target while still doing AoE damage to those targets around it, which is insanely useful. It has good AoE in general, and it's just looking very, very strong in Shadowlands. So if you love some DPS Warrior, this is probably going to be another good expansion for you as always. And let's talk about some protection Warrior. So protection, it has good physical and magic mitigation, has really strong cooldowns for those high damage situations. It has great mobility. It has good talent choices for those questions some of those bosses are asking you to answer. And it has spell reflection, which is unique to the protection warrior. It is just insane in some fights. You can completely negate some of that damage in Castle Nathria, depending on the spell that they throw at you. So it's very, very useful, and historically has been also pretty good in Mythic Plus as well. That was all of the classes and specs. The most important question you can ask yourself is, when you're playing this, is it fun to play? And I know that's a very, very cliche thing to say, but it is so absolutely true, because you're going to be spending literally hundreds of hours playing these characters, and you don't want to burn yourself out to a point where you just don't want to play the expansion anymore because it's not fun. You just want to play something that is absolutely fun. So keep that in mind when you are choosing your class. Are you being pressured into something that you don't really want to play from your raid team, or pressured to play a role that you don't necessarily want to play? It's okay to talk to the leadership and just discuss with them how you feel. Insist, if that's really, really what you want to play, insist. It's okay. Maybe there's a number of different classes that you just really, really enjoy playing, and it's hard for you to make that decision. And someone says, we need a brewmaster monk or something like that, whatever it is. And you're like, I'll totally play that. That's okay too. If you're really having a hard time making your decision and they just need something, that's okay to make that decision too. I just want to thank you guys so much for watching this video. This is by far the longest damn video I've ever done. If you really, really enjoyed the video, please throw me a sub. I love seeing those new subs. I work very, very hard on these videos, especially this one. If you liked the video, like it. I'll leave the links to all the socials down in the description. And I also stream on Twitch pretty frequently, so throw me a follow over there and just come hang out with me while we play some World of Warcraft. So again, guys, I appreciate it so much. I hope to see you around here more often. A lot more Shadowlands videos to come. I will see you around. Thanks, guys.